Welcome to Inside Xi's China, the Great Game Plan. In this episode, you will find out how much did the founder of modern-day China, Mao Zedong, shape his country. Besides setting the terms of engagement with India and America, he also institutionalized the Communist Party's tight grip over the private life of Chinese citizens and trampling even their most basic civil rights.
There is no emperor, but there is Mao. His presence is more widespread than theirs ever was. Wherever I turn, I see the cherubic face of Mao. Millions of his portraits, hundreds of millions of his little red books have been distributed around China.
Mao's dictatorial style later became a model for subsequent leaders to emulate. As he stifled any possibility of individual freedom, Mao also displayed no appetite for any difference of opinion. Mao created and perpetuated his cult status and brought into force political purge as a regular practice to contain any opposition. Even the present-day concentration camps for Uyghur Muslims owe their origins to Mao Zedong. As the founder of present-day China, Mao succeeded in reuniting a fragmented mainland China. He fought victoriously against the Americans in the 1950s in the Korean War, against India in the early 1960s, and against the Vietnamese in the 1970s. This was a complete contrast from China before 1949, when it lost every war during the 1840 to 1949 period. As Mao scripted history both within and outside China, he was driven by actions of fellow comrade Russian Premier Nikita Khrushchev, who had delegitimized communist icon Joseph Stalin. In just 3 years of Stalin's death, Khrushchev denounced the Russian dictator and the personality cult he had propagated. Khrushchev also spoke about the excesses that had become a hallmark of Stalin's style of ruling Russia. The de-Stalinization of Russia under Khrushchev made Mao wary of a similar possibility in China. After all, for Mao, a fate like Stalin meant a ruined legacy. But Khrushchev's public condemnation of Stalin also offered Chairman Mao the prospect of becoming the main pivot of socialism around the world. And Mao Zedong acted on this prospect, not once, but twice, each time with more disastrous consequences. Nikita Khrushchev's historic February 1956 secret speech to the 20th Congress of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union came at a time when Mao Zedong was fixing his image. In late 1956, Mao had launched the 100 Flowers movement, where critics of the party were welcome and intellectuals were encouraged to speak their mind against any policy. But little did Mao know that this would open floodgates for criticism that ranged from calls for human rights to having a free press. Mao was shocked to learn that Liu Shaoqi, his closest confidant and possible successor, also advocated adequate legal safeguards for counter-revolutionaries. These were progressive reforms that went against Mao's core beliefs of ruling with an iron fist. Soon, Mao cracked the whip since the avalanche of criticism was too much to take. Mao declared that poisonous weeds had to be removed from the fragrant flowers, and thus came an end to the 100 Flower movement.
He does not have to go to the people every 4 years for a mandate.
Stalin's fall was also a cautionary tale for Mao on the limits to allowing criticism. Betraying those who responded to his clarion call, Mao launched the anti-rightist movement. The campaign was a systematic targeting of all those who voiced their views during the 100 Flower campaign. Anyone who disagreed with the chairman was doomed. It was said that 1 in every 20 Chinese was a rightist and had to be identified, and this allowed the cadre to act on their whims. It also set the stage for Mao's first attempt to replace Soviet Union as the fountainhead of communism. To Mao, the timing seemed right, since by then Khrushchev had announced peaceful coexistence with the West. To the communist leadership in China, Khrushchev's position represented a grave ideological dilution. To Mao, it represented an opportunity to permanently shift the communist power center away from Soviet Union to China and to him.
Khrushchev denounced Stalin. While it was a bit of a surprise to Mao and he didn't like it for the top leader to be denounced by his former lieutenant, Mao was also not totally displeased because it gave China the scope to try to assert itself more within the communist bloc as a worthy, with Mao as a worthy successor to Stalin rather than Khrushchev.
To prove his brand of communism was superior, Chairman Mao felt it was important for China to become a center of industrial power. This would ensure that as a leader, Mao would be regarded as bigger than any Russian leader in the global pecking order. And so began the process of collectivization. Everything from farms to agricultural equipment were pooled in to form giant communes. People's land, cattle, equipment, just about everything was taken away from them as they were made part of a giant production machinery to create ever large amounts of food. This food had to be consumed by the commune, had to be sent to the industrial workers, and was meant to be exported. As party officials exaggerated figures about produce and made incorrect claims of a bumper harvest, taxes were increased from 20 to 28%. In reality, agricultural produce had fallen by a whopping 30%. What followed was widespread hunger, deprivation, and starvation as farmers had to fork out ever-growing portions as taxes. Though there are no official estimates, some experts believe as many as 40 million Chinese died due to Mao's madness.
Mao Zedong was responsible for somewhere between, let's say, 30 to 70 million unnatural deaths. That's because of the Great Leap Forward, the Cultural Revolution, and other disasters. That toll is horrific. China fell behind. This is, I think, an unmitigated disaster for the Chinese people.
This was the Great Leap Forward. Launched in 1957, the program followed the brutal campaign that targeted many critics and intellectuals. It seems most rational and bold voices in China had then been silenced, and no one had the courage to inform Mao about the damage his harebrained ideas were doing to the country. Deaths were predominantly in the rural areas, but the impact was significant even in urban areas, which had a completely different story to tell. Goaded to produce ever large amounts of steel, workers in cities and towns were required to melt everything they could to produce steel. This even included the pots and pans in their kitchens. Almost overnight, backyard furnaces sprang up all across China. Melting household items was part of Mao's idyllic vision to outproduce Great Britain and become a global power. In 1957, China produced 5.35 million tons of steel, and Mao wished to double this to 10.7 million tons the following year. Instead, the steel that came out of the mammoth melting project was worthless. As suffering peaked and the disaster of the Great Leap Forward became clear, Mao was pushed to the side. In 1959, Mao took formal responsibility of the devastation that was his creation and one of the worst man-made disasters ever. Taking responsibility for the colossal failure, Mao resigned as the head of state, and the moderate Liu Shaoqi was tasked with economic policy making. But Mao continued to be the chairman of the Communist Party, and his word was the final word. But within 5 years, Mao made another comeback. This was his second attempt to become the pivot of the socialist world and to ensure he didn't meet the same fate as Stalin. The result, though, was as disastrous as his previous attempt. Citing the need to attack the culture of bourgeois and capitalist rulers, in 1966, the infamous Cultural Revolution was announced. Mao incited his young and highly radicalized and fanatic supporters to undo anything that tied China to its bourgeois past.
So now, Mao launches a vast new purge called the Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution. It is neither proletarian nor cultural, and certainly not the revolution.
Mao used his choreographed swimming spectacle to launch the decade-long Cultural Revolution. Seen swimming in his customary float, the Chinese media claim Mao crossed the mighty Yangtze River a record 10 times. The exercise was aimed to ingrain Mao's position as the only leader capable of lifting China out of its past and guide it towards a glorious future. Armies of Red Guards who swore by Mao's Little Red Book went about vandalizing libraries, destructing civilizational treasures, and targeting anyone whom they felt was not a revolutionary in the class struggle. Soon, teachers, professors, scientists, writers, everyone were attacked. They were publicly humiliated and even beaten to death.
Mao launched the Cultural Revolution officially to give revolutionary experience to the young people of China so that they could keep the flames of the revolution going. Now, reality was much more mundane. Mao brought utter disaster to China in the Great Leap Forward, causing something like 40 million or more people being starved to death in a period of 3 years in peacetime. As a result of that, he was being sidelined, and his colleagues were trying to push China in a more pragmatic direction. Mao did not like that. And since he could not get the Communist Party to do what he wanted, he decided to bring his former lieutenants and the party structure to a collapse in order to seize power again and re-establish his control over China and take China back in the direction he wanted to go. And that's essentially what the Cultural Revolution really was about. It was a power struggle that has gone totally wild.